Hello and welcome to our panel today titled Displaced by Climate Change. We're so glad that you're joining us. For many of us, climate change is often portrayed as something that is a threat sometime in the future and that will it affect us in some other time, and right now it's only affecting a few insects and trees and maybe some polar bears. And not that that shouldn't stir us way more than it does. We were also wondering if it's already affecting people, and the title of this event gives away what we found. So before this event, we asked all of our guests to bring somebody along today. Not somebody who is personally with them at the moment, but somebody who they met and who is displaced by climate change. Because when we're talking about displacement, it's really easy to just be talking about numbers and statistics and projections. But we want to make sure today that we remember we're talking about real people. So I'd like to first head down to South Africa to Bertha Chiroro. Bertha is the Senior Project Coordinator at GenderCC South Africa. This is an NGO focusing on women's rights, gender equality, and climate justice.
The piece of the story is that of my own mother, who experienced the extreme weather patterns that happened in 2019 because of a cyclone Idai. My mother was one of the volunteers who was part of bringing food and prayers and trying to deal with the catastrophe with some of the people, because for some reason she finds herself at a higher level of the catastrophe when it hit the Southern Africa region, especially the countries of Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. The eastern parts of Zimbabwe were hit very badly to the level that a lot of the large area of Chimanimani, which is a mountainous area, was submerged into water, and therefore leading to millions of loss of lives. And because of that, of this painful experience, people are still bleeding from the loss of their relatives, and also coming back to find out that where there was a school, it's no longer there at all. Where there were villages and shops, they're no longer existing at all. And people are starting to rebuild their lives from nothing. And what has happened is actually a lot of conflict over resources, and a lot of conflict and also a lot of abuse of young women, because most of them, when the crisis, the cyclone happened, which is one of the intense cyclone which was caused by climate change happened, a lot of the children were actually in schools. And when they came back from their boarding schools, they came to the horror of finding that their homes were no longer there and their parents were no longer there. And because of that, they ended up with nothing. And because of lack of preparedness at that particular moment in time, they find themselves being abused by a lot of people and at the hands of people who took advantage of them in order for them just to give them shelter and food.
Thank you very much for sharing this this account. Let's bring the others into the conversation as well. Let's go to Asadullah Jawid is from a rural village in Afghanistan. He did his PhD in Kiel on environmental economics, focusing on climate change. He's been a research fellow at the University of Central Asia, and he is now an assistant professor of mathematics and statistics at the American University of Afghanistan. So he crunches a lot of numbers, but I was really impressed to find out, and I think it's unusual for mathematicians, that he has interviewed more than 2,000 farmers in Afghanistan. I was really blown away by that. His main topics include economic impacts of climate change on agriculture, farmers' perception of climate change and extreme weather events, and adaptation to climate change in this context. So welcome again, Asad, and who did you bring along for us today?
The story which I want to share with you is that of Ali, a 70-year-old man who I know personally from my childhood about 27 years ago. That's early 1990s. The family owned a big house, a couple of cows, tins of sheep and goods, and a couple of strong oxen. From his agricultural products, above fulfilling the needs of the family, he used to sell annually a good amount of almond, wheat, potato, and other products. During the winter months, Ali and his wife used to go to Pakistan, where there were relatives, and they were warmly welcoming the family. The amount of snowfall accompanied by the timely early spring rainfall was enriching the underground water reserves and supporting the streams during the late spring, summer, and fall months, which are the main cultivation and harvesting time in Afghanistan. The situation, though, had been changing gradually and sometimes drastically. The amount of winter snowfall as well as the spring rainfall started to decrease in late 1990s. Particularly in the year of 1999 and 2000, an extreme drought hit the region, resulting the entire river to go completely dry. In addition to the decrease in the amount of precipitation, the region became gradually warmer and witnessing more rainfall during the summer months, which is devastating most of the time. Finally, about 8 years ago, Ali had no other choice but to leave his beloved village and his beloved home and flee to Pakistan. The story of Ali is shared by many, many farmers across Afghanistan. Many of them had to leave their farmlands and their homes, heading towards large cities such as Kabul or neighboring countries such as Pakistan or Iran, and neither of which they were welcome.
For most of us, we don't hear much about these current effects. We always talk about future scenarios. So it's so important for us to hear what is happening today, now in the world. Can we sum up together? You've mentioned a few things. What happens when people are displaced by climate change? What happens when you lose everything and you show up in the city? What's the situation?
So right now, what tends to happen is that migration is a natural phenomenon. It's happening all the time. It happens without climate change. What climate change is doing is exacerbating the change that people are seeing and adding to the push factors. Migration is a combination of pull factors, people going in search of jobs or economic opportunity, and push factors. Many of the push factors are environmental degradation, people losing their livelihoods because of cyclones or floods or droughts. And what climate change is going to do, and is already doing, is enhancing the push factors because of environmental pressures on people and displacing more and more of them going forward. And generally, this adds to a secular movement of rural to urban. This is happening all over the world. The whole world is going from rural to urban. We are now well over half the global population is already urban, and we are headed for 2/3 to even 3/4 of the global population is going to become urban. So urban centers are the places where these migrants are going to end up. That's where they're going to go. So to a large extent, the problem of dealing with the migrants is a twofold problem: helping them where they are now to enable them to stay and survive. And as I mentioned in our strategy, the primary immediate strategy is to help the people in the places where they are already facing these problems, but understanding that over a period of time, they simply cannot continue to live there. They will have to move, and so their children will have to move. So what we are doing is we are investing in their children, their young girls and young boys, to enable them to not have to become farmers and fishers like their parents, but go and get educated and become nurses and doctors and lawyers and engineers in these different towns. And then, as I said, they can bring their parents and their grandparents to come and stay with them later. And this, in the climate change jargon, we call this a second-order adaptation. The first-order adaptation being helping people where they are cope with the problems that they are facing, but knowing that there's a limit to how much they can cope. In the long run, helping them to have this second-order adaptation, which is migration. Migration as an adaptation, not as a bad thing, but as a good thing.
And And probably a necessary thing, because even if we get on track to 1.5 degrees of warming, even then we will have people who need to move, right?
Absolutely.
Bertha, you touched, of course, on the gender aspect of the whole situation too, and about the vulnerabilities of girls and women. Can you tell us a bit more about that? How are women especially affected, and girls?
From what we've seen in Southern Africa, and also taking a leaf from what my other colleagues are talking about, when climate refugees move from areas of climate crisis as climate refugees, we've found that actually, and this is exactly what is happening in Southern Africa, that the climate refugees, they find themselves in very exploitative situations. And mostly if they are women and children, there's a lot of trafficking in terms of women and children. And also women find themselves in very much low-paid jobs that are very much exploitative. And at the same time, they find themselves also not even having find the suitable accommodation, even in the towns where they are actually able to move to. And also issues of access to education and other resources, even access to health is a challenge. And these are some of the things that when I heard Saleem talking about climate resilient friendly towns, it's something that I thought as people and as governments and everybody, we need to come together and think like that, to say, how do we offer protection and even a better life in terms of when people move away from as climate refugees, rather than for them to end up without any kind of protection, and at the end of the day, losing their dignity in the process.
In Brazil, particularly, we are facing many challenges. The amount of extreme weather events, like tornadoes, is intensifying. Floods are becoming more and more frequent. However, in the northeast part of Brazil, we are facing an intensification of drought and arid areas. So farmers in these regions are losing lot of their ability to sustain themselves, and they have to flee to other regions, most likely to cities near the coastal zones, which are quite richer. But this is not a solution. And we have been facing a very, very great challenge, which is the lack of data. We don't have enough data to prove that these people are fleeing their homes because of climate change.
The issue of data, I think, is quite critical. And that data should be gender disaggregated, because climate change, the way it impacts on men and women is different. Sometimes it's easier for men to just leave and go.
Saleem, the situation in Bangladesh being very famous, do you feel like you need more data to prove that it's happening because of climate change?
Well, I'm not one of those people that need a lot of data. If a thing is real, it's real. Whether it's 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people, 1,000,000 people, it's reality for even that one person. And so whether or not it's 1,000,000 or not 1,000,000 does not really matter. And when you ask the question in relation to climate change, the issue is, how do you attribute somebody having to move because of climate change? And that is not an easy thing to do, because floods and cyclones and hurricanes and droughts have always happened before human-induced climate change, before we interfered with the atmosphere. And so one has to then say, how do we know that this is because of human-induced climate change? That's a very, very difficult question to answer. And I would say that in the current situation, if you ask a person who is moving and say, is this person moving because of human-induced climate change? The answer is almost always very, very difficult to say yes. However, what you can say with a very high degree of credibility is that the number of people who will be forced to be displaced because of human-induced climate change around the world are in the many millions of people. That is a very highly credible number. Millions of people all over the world are going to be forced because climate change is making the climatic events that we used to have without climate change worse. They are more intense. A cyclone is more intense. A flood is more intense. A drought is more intense. And it is the intensity that causes the damage. A normal cyclone, we can survive. A very intense super cyclone, we can't survive. People die, and then those who survive have to leave. And so the attribution, this is a question of attribution to human-induced climate change, is becoming clearer. And I will argue that this year, 2020, will be known in future not just as the year of COVID-19, which it obviously will be remembered for, but also the year in which attribution to human-induced climate change is now being revealed everywhere around the world. The wildfires in California right now are human-induced climate change. They're super wildfires. We had a super cyclone here a few months ago that was a super cyclone that is normally much, much stronger than we would normally have because the sea surface temperature was higher. In the Caribbean right now, they're having the 29th hurricane of the season. Hurricanes are normal, maybe half a dozen hurricanes a year. 29 hurricanes they are having this year. That is abnormal. That is human-induced climate change. That is attribution to the fact that we have interfered with the global temperature well over 1 degree already. And it's headed for 3 degrees unless we are rapidly able to bring it down to 1.5 degrees. But even with 1.5 degrees, there's going to be a significant amount of impacts. And the numbers projected into the future are in the many tens of millions, possibly in the hundreds of millions of people displaced. In the climate change regime, we don't call them climate migrants. We call them displaced due to climatic impacts. And this is because they lose their livelihoods, which is why they are forced to move. And it falls under something called loss and damage from climate change, which is a very politically sensitive issue in the global negotiations on climate change.
It's known that the first movement that people do when they have an environmental problem, when they are displaced by a climate extreme event, is to try and seek refuge inside or within their own country's border. However, that is not, in not all the situations it is possible to do that. And when these people have to flee to other countries, then they truly become a refugee. I recently argued in a paper that these people must indeed be called climate refugees because they can no longer sustain their lives in their homeland. It is not possible for them to keep their livelihood there, and they have no support from the government. They have no social protection. So when they have to move to another country and they are received, well, we're facing a huge international wave of xenophobia. And these people have no international protection because they are not recognized as refugees. Well, then we have a problem that is a problem for at least tens of thousands of people all around the world. So although we still call it climate displacement, we should truly call it climate refuge seeking people, because they are truly seeking refuge elsewhere.
Yes, that's a very important message to take along also. I see you all reacting and agreeing. Yes, Saleem.
Can I come in on that?
Yes, you can. Go ahead.
So let me build on Bertha's excellent suggestion. Different fora have different discourses where they look at things from a very typical different lens. So the term refugee has a forum under the UN Refugee Council where they define what is a refugee. And as you said, they are political refugees and they don't accept climate as the refugee category. There is the fora of the Climate Change Convention, which I mentioned, where again, they don't use the word refugee, they use displacement due to climate change. And then there is the forum of the UN Security Council and security industry or defense ministries around the world, where they see this as a security threat, as migration due to, and people like the Pentagon are very concerned about this. So it depends on where the conversations are taking place in terms of what the terminologies, appropriate terminologies would be. But I want to build on Bertha's suggestion that all of us on this call, we belong to civil society. So we can advocate, we can move forward. And I would say, let us do an advocacy for a climate refugee passport to be recognized. So we have a process, we will come up with it. I don't know what it is now, but we will have to come up with a process of identifying who qualifies to be a climate refugee and then issue that person with a passport that enables that person to be recognized and then to go wherever they want to go, wherever countries will accept them. Hopefully some countries will be open to accepting them and make that a acceptable process. It won't happen easily. Governments will not like it. So we have to bring pressure from civil society to make it happen. One has to make a big distinction between crossing international borders or not crossing international borders. And one of the areas, an interesting case that is developing is with a number of the small islands in the Pacific, the small atoll islands like Tuvalu and Kiribati in particular, which are very, very vulnerable to sea level rise and to storms, where they are discussing with the government of New Zealand, and New Zealand is proposing to offer them migration as climate refugees, as climate migrants. And so they are negotiating a bilateral treaty with the government of New Zealand, where New Zealand has said, yes, we will recognize them as having a right to come to New Zealand, where there are already large populations. So there's large number of people from Tuvalu still already live in New Zealand. A large number of people from Kiribati already live in New Zealand. So this is not new. But now, because of climate change, the government of New Zealand, which is a progressive government under Prime Minister Ardern, that she is now recognizing that, yes, climate change is going to cause them to have to leave their country. And we in New Zealand, we will look after them. We will welcome them. We will allow them to come. So these things are beginning to happen in very specific places, and we need to build on that. We need these good examples to be replicated around the world, and we need everybody to join forces to do this, because not dealing with it, and this is the point we have in the Climate Change Convention on loss and damage, is if we fail to deal with it early, then it becomes a crisis which we cannot deal with. It becomes almost impossible to deal with.
We were talking about, and I think, Saleem, you called it the second order solutions or adaptation as the migration. Can we go back to the first order and maybe ask Assad in Afghanistan? I think in your case, there are things that can be done on the first order. So, when people don't have to move yet, but there are adaptation possibilities for them at this point. Can you tell us what these would be?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. Regarding the adaptation, yes. There are a couple of reasons we have to help the farmers stay their villages, continue farming, continue working, continue producing in their villages, rather than leaving for cities. First of all, the cities are not having that capacity. Take Kabul as an example. Kabul is built for 1 million and up to 2 million maximum. Nowadays, it's being inhabited by 5 up to 6 million. It's really overexploited. And the city with its infrastructure cannot support that many people. And it's a crisis by itself. This example can be extended to the other large cities as well. This is one part of the story. The other part of the story is that the people who are leaving their homes from the villages, they're not having opportunities. If they had opportunities, that would be a good or a positive side of leaving their homes and going to the other cities or to the other countries. The problem is that when they leave, they don't know what happens. their employment opportunities, a better life, access to education or health is quite limited or highly uncertain. Therefore, we need to have, at least in the short and or medium term, since we are talking about the country whose economy is based on agriculture, over 90% of exports are agriculture based, over 2/3 of the people are engaged in agriculture. We have to, at least in the short and medium term, help the farmers stay their homes. And that's only possible through a nationwide adaptation. That adaptation, first of all, we have to recognize that climate is a real crisis. Adaptation to climate change has to go at the front line of policy. So that's the first step. Second step, we have to develop policies adaptation for intervention. And since adaptation to climate change is quite local-based, we need a true scientific research. That adaptation and intervention should be based on science, not politics, not bargaining powers of different parties. That's the second step. The third step is real work. We have to go and we have to really help the farmers, both intellectually and financially, because the farmers, they know their villages, they know the environment they are living with. Of course, they are facing now with huge or more challenges due to climate change, but still, if we help them, they can come up with solutions.
And Bertha, tell us about adaptation measures that you're engaged with. You've already told us some of them, but also what are some gender-specific adaptation measures that you're engaged with?
When I look at the first thing that I look at is basically to look at the adaptation strategies that are being put in place by all countries, that they should be part and parcel of development planning. And therefore, a gender lens should always be used all the time in terms of ensuring that different government departments do not work in silos, because this is one of the challenges that we do find, that when policies are put together, in terms of their implementation, there is no holistic approach towards the challenge of migration. And this is something that actually causes a number of challenges when migrants move, especially across the borders and things like that. So maybe even at the regional level, there is that need of bringing together a kind of a concerted effort to discuss adaptation strategies as development planning, which is a kind of a holistic approach at the regional level, so that at least climate migrants will not be seen in that kind of horrible light that they are seen, and where they can be accommodated. But also at the same time, I believe that there is also so much to share within small-scale farmers to ensure that even they can still continue, because of a lot of education and a lot of sharing of information, to ensure that a number of those who do not necessarily even want to move will be given the necessary resources, be it information and resources, to ensure that they will be able to adapt and cope to the ravages of climate change, to avoid the major movements of people. So basically, I think it needs to be a kind of a two-pronged strategy, where adaptation strategies are seen as development planning by development planners, in terms of trying to ensure that the people within regions or within countries, they are given the necessary and information to be able to cope. And even whenever they move across to other regions, there is also a policy which governs that, so that at least they're not treated in a bad light. So basically, bringing together adaptation and development planning as one, and also a gender approach and human rights approach, to make sure that all peoples are protected and given the dignity that they deserve and require as human beings. And as Professor Saleem said, this is something we need to do now before, rather than when we deal with it as a crisis, then it becomes unmanageable. It's something we need to be proactive about some of these things to ensure that our people, wherever they are, they do have the necessary skills to ensure that they are able to cope with climate change wherever they are. And those who move, they are properly integrated. We need proactive solutions from a civil society level and even to our government level and even at the international level to deal with the issues of migration.
And the two-pronged approach you just described, I think, sums up perfectly what is necessary. My final question to all of you is basically your biggest wish. What policy changes or other changes do you consider the most needed?
Actually, in Afghanistan, we have been trying to develop a group of the people who are interested in the topic of climate change, because not many people are. And we hope that we do a couple of things. First, increase awareness by pushing the Minister of Education to add the topic of climate change into the curriculum of schools. And second, encourage the young people who are studying environmental sciences to choose their thesis, for example, in climate change related issues. I wish that at least in Afghanistan, the climate issue moves to the front line of policy and should be put on the main table and should be dealt as important issue. And in that line, I wish that we should start with a true research on climate change and adaptation, because I think that's the first step for understanding the situation.
Well, I think there are two main changes that I would like to see in order to walk the talk. First, people must get to know the problem. We must spread awareness to everyone so they know that there is a real problem happening. And this thing that we are doing today, led by you, is a very important part of the solution, because we are spreading awareness. We are reporting real cases. So we are giving a face to the problem, and people sympathize to faces, to stories, and that's very important. The second most important thing that we must do after this huge wave of awareness is that we must walk the talk. We must tell our governments, tell our enterprises, our communities that we must do something. We must try to develop a common sense of protection for the environment, protection for the people.
Well, let me mention one opportunity that is coming up within the next year. Under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, we were supposed to have the 26th Conference of Parties meeting in Glasgow, Scotland, in fact, just a few weeks ago, but it has been postponed by a year to November 2021 because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the most important items on the agenda is this issue of loss and damage, within which potential climate migration or displacement due to climate change is an issue. The vulnerable countries, including my country, Bangladesh, which now chairs a group of countries called the Climate Vulnerable Forum, has taken this issue up as a major topic to be resolved in COP26. And we are hopeful that we can get some movement and agreement on this. It's not going to be easy because there is very strong opposition, mainly from the rich polluting countries, to recognize loss and damage in the first place, because they don't like to recognize that they might have some liability involved. But nevertheless, it's an issue that we are going to push for very strongly in the negotiations. And those of you who are perhaps involved in civil society and engaged in the process, I hope that you will also engage and bring pressure to bear on your own governments in the negotiations, but also join forces with civil society more broadly, which will be making a major effort to get a decision made under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Because if it's a climate change related issue, that's the forum where a decision will have to be made. Other fora are not climate change fora per se. It's a climate change negotiation where the link to climate change, migrant, refugee, displaced, whatever we want to end up calling them, but the climate change link belongs under the UN Framework Convention. And we have to push there to make it happen. It won't be easy, but it will be possible if we can join forces to do that. Thank you.
I think from what we're seeing here, I see a coming together of ideas. First of all, the networking in terms of dealing with the whole issue of being proactive on the whole migration issue. That is very, very important. And the last thing that I would like to call upon everyone wherever we are, is to have a human rights-based and gender-responsive approach that should be embedded in development planning so that we can be able to address environmental climate change migration by linking human mobility and disaster risk reduction and issues of protection being brought in together as one. And the whole idea of creating the issue of awareness, because the climate crisis is with us and we have to deal with it proactively. There is no way of running away from it. That is the only way I'll have to end by saying we cannot think about development and then about adaptation and then about migration in silos. We have to approach these issues holistically if we want to deal with these issues. Thank you.
Thank you to all four of you for taking us into the present day reality of climate change and shedding light on what is already happening. And I think for us in Germany here, the message really needs to be, we have to stop thinking about this as a future problem. It is a present day problem, and those who are contributing least to climate change are suffering the most already. So, figure out what is important, what is the next step, get to know the problem, as Issa said, network, put pressure on our politicians, and really try to move things forward. Thank you so much. And to all of you, have a good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.